do that. All right. And the other thing I am going to start right now is we do have closed captioning available for this program. You can turn that off or on your screen. Using the buttons at the bottom, you should see a closed captioning option for yourselves as well. And then, of course, the basic etiquette of all of our Zoom meetings. Generally speaking, we do ask that you stay muted if you are not actively talking. And again, that you can feel free to turn your video off or on if you'd like. And again, feel free to use the chat if you want to share any information as we go along or questions. And I think Sarah and Emily will sort of talk through how they're going to work their presentation. But without any further ado, I am going to turn it over, I guess, to start with, to Sarah Rooker. Sarah, take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. I'm Sarah Rooker, and you should see Emily Zea on the screen as well. And we're both happy to be here today to share with you a project the two of us have been working on for the past year, where we've created a set of driving tour podcasts for the Norwich Historical Society and accompanying comic books to go with them for kids, although adults like them too. In this workshop, we're going to present it using Google Slides. So all the notes and links that we're going to sort of pop in and out with will be on the Google Slides, and we can share that with you later. So just know that everything will be easily available for you after the fact. And we're going to try not to get super techie today, but if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Some we might pick up as we're going along, and others we might hold until the end. And if you're wanting to get a little techier with, into the weeds with a little bit of it, we could stay on at the end for a few more minutes, and I could take you down the rabbit holes of some of that if it's something you're interested in. But we're going to sort of give you more of an overview of the how-to that we did this, and not delve super deep into audio engineering and things like that. So I think those are the main things I want to say. And the other, I guess, two more things. Bear with us as we move between Google presentation and Google Maps and our website and Flipbooks. And, it's a techie workshop, and we're going to assume it's all going to flow just perfectly, but you never know. And we're going to be playing some audio. It shouldn't be too loud. I think we have it set, but you might need to turn it up or turn it down a little bit, especially if you have earbuds on. It might be a little loud for you. We'll just have to see. So here we go. All right. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Thumbs up, Emily. Can we see the screen okay? So the Norwich Historical Society has this mission to foster a greater sense of place and community by presenting stories about the past. And I just want to say that I feel that helping people see the architecture and see the landscape and be able to look at a building and tell a story about it connects them deeply to their place, and it makes them care about it more, and it makes them want to be part of their community more. It's just like when you read about environmental education, where educators say that children who are out in the woods and get to know the trees and the flowers and just play will want to be environmentalists. It's the same with the cultural landscape. And so I feel really strongly about offering educational opportunities for community members of all ages to really learn how to see their world. And it's amazing how many people don't see architecture and don't see their world and just drive by it without really looking. So that's something that we really want to do. At the Historical Society, we have all sorts of different programs to get into this: walking tours, exhibits, school programs. We do special events and volunteering. But when COVID came about, there was, I noticed a real burst of online programming. And I was personally really overwhelmed by all the online Zoom opportunities, and they didn't feel relevant to what I was going through. I noticed how many people were out walking and connecting with what they were needing and what they were finding. to bring comfort. I wanted to connect to those things. And I wanted to provide people with things to do rather than just consume. And so I created these I Spies, house investigations, how to find out the history of your home, all sorts of activities that people could do while they were outside. This evolved to include hiking trail histories in the summer, but it also backfired when I got and continued to get lots of people asking about how to research their house and needing help. But the project that clearly became the most popular was our podcast driving tours. And thanks to a grant from the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation through the National Park Service, which the Norwich Historic Preservation Commission received, we'd already been planning a series of driving tour podcasts. I visited Pulteney Historical Society, who had some podcast tours to learn about what they did. But COVID completely changed the project, and it changed it for the better. So you see we created 3 podcast tours. Early settlement, went on Norwich schools, going to all the schoolhouses, and went on rivers and mills. So I'm just going to play you a tiny bit of our schools tour just so you can hear it. And Emily, thumbs up when you're hearing it.
Welcome to our Norwich Schoolhouse podcast tour. I'm Milt Fry and
I'm Wendy Thompson.
I was the principal at Marion Cross School from 1973 until 1996.
And I was a teacher at Marion Cross School for 30 years.
We'll start and end our tour here at the Norwich Historical Society, directly across the street from Marion Cross School. There are 7 stops along the way. As you listen, we'll give directions to each stop.
When you hear this sound, pause the podcast until you reach the next stop on your tour. You can also follow the podcast on the accompanying map. Vermont was the first state to authorize public education in its constitution. Education was a priority for Norwich's early residents, many of whom were friends with Eleazar Wheelock, founder of Dartmouth College. Before Vermont was even a state, Norwich had built its first school and divided the town into districts.
So that just gives you a little sense of the beginning of the tour. It had music, it had some sound effects, and it went to 7 or 8 stops to look at all the schoolhouses in town. So to begin working on this tour, we had to create a map and figure out where we were going to go. Our tours were part of, were featuring houses and buildings listed on the National Register, and this partially dictated our tour routes. They all began at the Historical Society so people could pick up a map and a safe place to download the tour. The idea was that they would listen to 3 or 4 minutes of the tour, hear some music, pause the podcast, drive to the next spot, stop, and hit play. To begin working on it all, I created a Google map where I just started to link. This is one for a farm tour we're actually about to do. But I figured out my stops, and I wrote in a little bit about what the information is. And then what I really wanted to get on these was the exact location so that I could, on my maps and in the podcast tour, say at 32 Butternut Road, Norwich, so that people could put that in their phone if they needed to, although they were pretty easy driving routes. It was really important. I did run this through the police department, and it was important to them and to me that people were not driving and listening at the same time. So it was really clear that at the end of the tour, you were to hit pause. And we said that every time, and that's how we had a little music to begin and end so that people wouldn't miss some speaking in between their driving. We also talked to all the property owners, and we were choosing places with good parking and paying attention to privacy as we were developing the locations. The next step was to create a script, and I wrote the initial script. It included a little bit of history or context and architectural descriptions. As COVID hit, we were having a little bit of trouble getting our two narrators together to do the recordings. And we decided that we would ask homeowners if they would actually do narration. And it turned into a real community project. And so on the early settlement tour, each stop had about 3 parts. One was the owner. So here we have Emily Myers, who's helping to share the history of the farm. And she told us a little smidge about growing up on the farm and about living there. Then there was a bit of historical context. And then there was architectural description. So it would say, as you look at this house, notice it has a hipped roof and a center chimney. That means there were big fireplaces. And so it was real descriptive to help people start to see the building more deeply. Yeah. We also tried really hard to have it be an inclusive history, which we'll talk about when we get down to the comic book. And we tried not to have it be too genealogical. It was more about what you could see in the bigger story than first this person owned it and then that person and the next person, because really people didn't need to know that. That was not what they were most interested in hearing. They wanted story. So after we wrote the script and chose our narrators, we took our first 2 narrators to CATV, our local community broadcast station. And here's Wendy and Milt, who you just heard a couple of minutes ago, reading the script for the One Room Schools podcast. At first, I had Milt read it, but then we realized we needed the second voice and that a female voice would add good contrast to the script and energy. So Wendy came on, and she then became the podcast producer, which was a huge help. COVID arrived just after we recorded this and just after CATV had taught me how to edit the recording. It was really lucky. So I had a beginner's knowledge of how editing software worked right at the shutdown. And we had to change our plans pretty quickly. And we moved to using cell phones for doing our recording. We used the voice memo for our iPhone or whatever voice memo people had on their phones. We learned that using earbuds with a microphone made for much better sound. So we sent out the script, and community members recorded on their phone their bit, and then they texted or emailed it to me. And it worked pretty well. The sound actually came out pretty well, especially when we had earbuds. It's not quite as smooth as when we did it at CATV, but I think one of the things I learned, and COVID forced me to learn, was that you can do this pretty low tech on your phone and have a decent outcome. I have to say though, for the early settlement podcast, where at every stop we had a homeowner read their piece and then text it to me, that was a lot of editing. That took a lot of time. So after everybody sent me all of their various little bits of files, I converted them all to MP3. I had to convert them all to the exact same file format. And to keep it simple so that the homeowners wouldn't get overwhelmed by all the requests, I just said, read it into your phone and send me whatever file it is and I'll figure it out. And luckily I only got 2 or 3 different kinds of files, and I was able to find free online file conversions to make it all be the same so that all the recordings would talk to each other. Then we needed to find some music, and we looked for royalty-free music. And here, this is the music we chose for the early settlement. So we chose some music that was appropriate for the time period. And then we also needed some other sounds like that school bell. We had done another little podcast that included the church bell. We needed a church bell. So we found the church bell, but you can see all the different kinds of sound effects you could get. If you wanted, you could have a heartbeat, make it all sound mysterious, or a ding sound. Cows could moo. That would be very Vermonty. After I had all the little bits of recordings from people and I had the music, it was time to stitch it all together into one file. And for that, I used Audacity. Audacity is a free open source recording software. So you see, so far, I haven't really spent a ton of money except for my own time here. And you could record directly into Audacity if only one person was reading the podcast, or you can import all the little files like I did and combine them with the music. You can change the volumes, you can remove voice glitches, all the little coughs that people make, all those kinds of things we can fix with Audacity. Audacity looks a little bit like this. And so here I've put in the entire recording and you can hear it, maybe. Oh. You're not gonna be able to hear it because we're on Zoom, but it looks like this, and you can just basically cut and paste things. So this is a cough right here. And I can highlight it and cut it and take out the cough, and then the music will go, remove the cough, and then Wendy's voice will continue. So it's almost like word processing. So there it is. So I had my file with all my music and my voice into one long recording that was about an hour long. And I then needed to have, then I sent it off. Actually, I was really nervous about having done this myself. So I sent the file off to CATV and said, could you please make sure this sounds okay? And they wrote back and said, good job. And they didn't actually change anything. So that made me feel good, but they were willing to fix anything I had messed up. We needed a podcast host, and I chose Podbean, which is free. You can upload your podcast file and you're allowed up to 5 hours and some limited storage space. And then there's an unlimited number of downloads, and you don't get surprises if your podcast goes viral and everybody in Vermont wants it. You won't get charged for lots of downloads. So Podbean, so Podbean, which I'm not going to show you right now, looks like this. You can put you bring up all of your tours, and it provides a spot for them to live online so that people can find your files. Podbean submits automatically your podcast then to directory. So if you're on your phone and you want to listen to a podcast, if you're on an iPhone and you listen to, Apple Podcast or Spotify or Pandora, that's how you get them all onto these different apps that are on your phone. You can also embed your file from Podbean onto your website, which we also did. So here's a page from our website, and I'm just going to take us to our website. Which is loading slowly. And so here's the Norwich schools. So I embedded the podcast from Podbean so that someone could just listen to it right on the website without using their phone if they didn't want to drive anywhere. Or they could get it from their phone from Apple Music or Google Play Music, which I just discovered is not working when I tried to link on it a few minutes ago, of course. Then we also put up here the transcript so that if anyone wanted to just read it, they could read the whole transcript. So here it all is. We also had the map available for people to download because during COVID, it was easier to just make sure that people could get everything from home. But we also printed up the map and had it available at the Historical Society so people could get copies there. So this is what the map looked like. And so it had each stop, the address, and then just a little blurb about what it was and photos of the building. So here's the schoolhouse one and the map. So they could take that with them. We also put on the website family activities. This was during the time when kids were home from school, and a lot of kids did the activities that were connected to these tours. So all this went up on the page, and it gave people a lot of options. And a lot of people did listen to this podcast tour just from home. Finally, Podbean will allow you to give you a little bit more information about what the download rate has been. So this is just what's been happening with one of the podcasts recently. And you can see how many people have been following or listening to these podcasts. It's been gigantic. Almost every child in the elementary school has gone on these tours. So they've been extremely popular and people have been really grateful for them. During COVID, it's given them something to do, to get out safe and really explore the town. So we finished the podcasts, and our third grade, who learns Norwich history, could no longer come to the Historical Society for any kinds of local history programming. And I began to brainstorm and talk with Emily about how we might illustrate these podcasts for kids. And we created this comic book and also reworked the podcast, shortening it a little bit, making some of the language more accessible, and produced a slightly shorter podcast to go with this comic book. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And I just now can see the chat, so I just want to look. The funding sources for this were was the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation's grant as part of the Certified Local Government Program, because we focused strictly on the National Register buildings in our community. And it was a way for us to take all the work that we've been doing on the National Register and really help people in the community understand their history and appreciate them. So that was the funding for it. And I showed that much of the technology was free. It was really about time in creating this. And yeah, there would be no photos right now on this because it was really a podcast. It was an audio driving tour. So all you're hearing is what you would hear in your car as you drive along. I'll show you at the very end a video that CATV created of the podcast, so you can see how that worked. But now I'm going to turn you over to Emily, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the comic books.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen here. All right, here we go. So we did this comic book, and here it is. I got it right here. So this was the first one that we did, the early years, becoming Norwich, the start of our town. Let me move that up there. There we go. So let's flip through real quick and take a look at some of the art.
Oh, I would also say that each page of this comic book matches with a stop on the podcast tour.
Yeah. So we had the whole podcast script, but listening to something is a little different than reading it with a comic book when you have the added visual information of the drawings. So we worked through the scripts, making them shorter and deciding what could be conveyed through images instead of writing or listening. So the page per stop here, can see, oops, sorry, my cat is being intrusive here. Let me just move her.
Well, you move her. I just want to say that on this page with the Abenaki, we wanted to be really inclusive and make sure that our story began with the Abenaki. Our timeline for the Historical Society right now begins with 1761 in the charter. And I have a real problem with that. And so we wanted to be sure we included this earlier piece, and we worked really closely with the Abenaki on the imagery here. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah. So you can see this flip book works a little bit like a comic book, like the pages flip and turn. So it's a very nice thing to have as a resource online, as well as a printed version. But it's nice to have it available in this form as well. And keep on going here. Meeting House Hill, the Peter Alcott's store. Lots of nice visuals to help tie together the research with a visual representation.
And so you can see in these, whereas the podcast talks a lot about the architecture and what you're seeing, the podcast will say, look out at this house and you'll see, this many windows and this door, and it changed like this. But we really wanted to make sure there was context and give kids a sense of what life was like. And this page here, we really wanted to make sure we included women. And of course, in our National Register nomination forms, it's all about the men. Men. And women are barely mentioned at all. And so this page was an important one for us. So we worked hard to include where we could the Abenaki, include the story of Lucy Terry Prince, who came to Norwich, so that we had a woman of color, a strong woman of color speaking. And we wanted to look at the store and how the colonial world was connected to, or Norwich was connected to the broader world. So there were a lot of themes and topics we were trying to get through to the kids in this.
There you go. And then here on the back, we had a lot of other ways to get involved with history in your community. All COVID safe things that you could do throughout the summer to keep kids involved and active in the town, and kind of like a unifying experience for everybody, even if you couldn't do it together. All right, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually made it and the kind of art, how the art came into this. Let's see here. Present. Cool. All right, so here were our two covers. So obviously a very important thing with history is collecting your reference photos and having a good collection before you even get started, so you don't have to redraw a whole bunch of things. You can see here, this is the Marion Cross School, our elementary school right in the middle of town, a very recognizable building. So I definitely wanted to focus on a couple of things that would very clearly draw your eye to what it is, such as this window here, or the turret. Two things that very obviously say what it is. So anybody who opens up to this page and drives through Norwich at all would recognize it and instantly recognize something from town to kind of pull you into the comic.
And what we did was we had a Google Drive folder, and for every page of the comic book, we put reference photos into it so that Emily could look at the photos as she was thinking through how to draw and construct the pages.
Yeah, it was very helpful to be able to go through and sometimes see buildings from different angles, from the ground, maybe illustrations other people have done of it. Here is a Pattersonville, which was a lot of fun to draw. It's easy to get kind of bogged down with little details. When you're doing a lot of buildings like this, it's helpful to sort of just think of all buildings as built from shapes. Everything is just a box, different complicated little boxes. So when you are building a little group of buildings like this, it's much easier to kind of create the shapes before you start doing the garden or chimneys or things, just kind of like placing things out and making sure the base is correct before you get too sucked into to the details of the landscape or the little people, that sort of thing. So thinking of anything that you're drawing as made from shapes is very helpful for this sort of part. Here was our transportation page, which required a lot of reference. It was a little tricky to get this one correct, so I had to use a lot of different tools. I went to the bridge in person to draw things from the ground level. But since we wanted a bird's eye view, I definitely needed to use a lot of photos, and a tool that I found very helpful was actually Google Maps and using the 3D view, because sometimes it's a little hard to translate something into like a 2D version in your head. So it was helpful to get on Google and look at different angles of a location, and that was also a great tool for a couple of other different spots. But especially if you're curious about some place that you can't physically go visit, that's a very nice tool to use. Yeah, so here is our Ledgered Bridge. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the actual drawing process. These are some of my thumbnails, which are very, very small. I've included a Vermont state quarter here, so you can see just how small. So these are very, very fast, even just like a couple seconds for each. So fast that you're just getting all of the ideas out of your head as fast as you can to maybe get through the bad ideas to get to some of the good ones. So just drawing things over and over and over again, even if you're just drawing the same thumbnail a couple times with barely any changes, will still help get to the good ideas. So I would say I spent like 5-10 seconds on each one of these. And then once you find the right or the close composition that you like, you move on to getting a little bit more detailed. So this was the 2-page spread of Water Power and Pattersonville. You can see it's very, very rough. These were probably a couple minutes, and this is a good, these ones were a bit bigger, probably like the size of your iPhone. And you can, when it's a little bit bigger like this, it's easier to sort of identify problems, size hierarchy in particular, what information you want to stand out more, things that should be smaller. So for instance, this otter here is Ollie the otter. He's the little tour guide of this comic book, but he doesn't need to be so big. He's like bigger than the mill here, and he's not the focus of the page. So in drawing it like this, it's easy to identify the things that moving forward you'll want to change. And then it would be on to your pencils. So these are much bigger. You want to work bigger than the printed size, because things look a little bit better when they're shrunk down as opposed to blown up. Your details look tighter, and it just looks a lot neater when it's shrunken down. So these pencils were a lot of fun to work on. You can see I made changes from these thumbnails. For instance, this person working on a chair is now photographs of the people who would have worked there. And Ollie the otter is a little bit smaller here. When you're at this final pencils phase, I don't want to get too bogged down with redrawing things. This is not yet the final how it'll look. But if you keep redrawing things, trying to make it perfect, it's going to take a very, very long time to get to the next phase. And sometimes changing and editing things digitally is just much, much faster. So these pencils are as close as we wanted to get in this phase. And then the next thing to do is inking it to really finalize the lines that you want to use. So here was the final inks that have been cleaned up quite a bit, much less sketchy, cleaner lines. You can see I haven't drawn the ox down here because
we had issues with the oxen.
Very hard to draw those legs. So I wanted to do that in Photoshop instead of redrawing him a million times. So when you're working with the line work and doing the toning digitally like I did, it was very, very helpful to scan these different elements separately instead of scanning the whole page as one big line work. So for instance, like Ollie the otter is one element scanned as one image. this whole thing up here is one JPEG. And it makes it much easier for messing around with your composition later on. So as you can see here, all of these things are pretty close together. There's not much room for text, which is necessary in a history comic book. I can't get all of the information across just with these images. So having them separately will be, scanned separately will be much easier for future editing in that case. The other thing with line work, to make it dynamic, it's very helpful to use different line widths. Having line variation helps with depth and focus on detail. So having like a couple different pens and maybe brush pens or like different sizes is your friend for inking your line work. And then on to shading. You can see that I have changed the composition a lot here. If you look at water power in particular, you can see this banner was like right on top of the mill, and wasn't any, it's very, very tight. You want some breathing room so your eye has room to move to different elements instead of feeling like it's being crushed by all the images. So there's a lot more space. There's room for dialogue here. Ollie is even smaller now. There's, and yeah, the room for text. So that was a very helpful thing to be able to have these elements on different layers would be the term in Photoshop, to be able to move them and get this breathing room. And the flat grays are actually not gray. They are all black. And what I did instead was mess with the opacity, which makes it easier to change grays as you're going forward. You know, maybe I thought these roofs were too dark, so I could change that a little bit without actually having to choose a different gray. It's still black. It's just, 40% black instead of 60. And you can also tell it's doesn't have quite the depth that I would want it to have. One good trick for depth is atmospheric perspective, which you can see, especially up here with Pattersonville, how it's lighter down by the horizon, and then it gets darker as you go up. That really helps with depth. And especially, in Vermont, with all of our beautiful views, being able to really show the distance is key for showing how it would actually look in reality. So I use a lot of different gradations because it really, really helps make it look a bit more natural instead of just flat, flat, flat.
I would also add in at this point that I was also really carefully reviewing, as we were going here, the details around, say, the ox yoke, and is the saw the correct orientation to the water, and looking at lots and lots of references, sending out some of these images to other local historians in the community to make sure that we were representing the town in the right way. So there was a lot of review going on by quite a number of people in town, but looking at the clothing to make sure that boy was, late 19th century clothes and not early 19th century clothes. All those little details are important.
Very. Which was, and with all of these edits and changes, it being digital was much faster than having to, redraw his outfit in pencil. Doing it digitally, it was much faster. So having combining all of that reference with the digital drawing was good and speedy. And then the next part was adding in the shadow, which you can see adds quite a bit of difference. Shows a lot of depth. It's important to pick a light source. You can see there's a little sun here, which means this would be dark. And it also draws your eye in to some of these locations a little bit more when you have the grounding detail of shadow. You can see when it's not, these guys kind of get lost a little bit. So adding in the shadow definitely draws your eye where you need it to go, which was necessary to make it look like a finished, polished piece of work. All right. And now we're gonna do a little drawing demo for the Abenaki that we featured in the Becoming Norwich Early Years comic. So I'm going to leave that. There we go. Go over here. So we talked a lot with the Winter Center about things that I could do to make this more accurate. And they came back with lots of great tips and fixes I could do. So I'm going to do some of them for you right now to show you kind of how the digital drawing works. So one of the main ones was that this basket down here, I did the weaving quite incorrectly. So we got some good feedback on that. So what I'm gonna do is just get rid of this stuff here so I can fix it. I'm using a drawing tablet, Wacom drawing tablet, which has a little digital pen. It's good for traveling, going over to the Norwich Historical Society, and it's nice for taking places. All right, so let's see here. This basket would have had more horizontal instead of vertical, gone more like this. And then you would have been able to see like the slats sort of holding it all together. And those would alternate between the horizontal pieces. So we're gonna add that in like that.
And I just want to point out that this is probably, I think, one of the most important things as you're doing your little drawing, your drawing here, that we did with this project was to work closely with the Winter Center for Indigenous Traditions to be sure that we were telling the Abenaki story appropriately, and being sure that the clothing and the way their encampment was, everything, we'd even drawn the fire wrong. So they were really wonderful at helping to be sure that we were catching all these little details. I was working on I was able to do corrections around, the silhouette of the women's clothing, but not things like the baskets.
Yeah. Let's see. Another important thing is her shoes here. I did them pretty basic, and in reality, there'd be a little bit more detail in how they were stitched together. Add on that little detail, which really helps. There, much better. Check those off. Yeah, so the fire height as well, that is incorrect. That is much too high and not safe for anybody to be standing so close to. So we're gonna make that much smaller. Delete that. Maybe something more like that. There we go, much safer. Maybe there would have been, more fires down the bank too. So maybe like adding in another, something down the river there. Let's see. All right, there's our fire height. Would have been more children. I only see 2, which wouldn't be. So let's see. Maybe like over here, we'll add somebody, little kid helping with this fish drying rack. Maybe somebody else standing right here.
When Emily did this for me, suddenly it dawned on me that I did not need to be fussing so much with all of her pencil sketches, and I could just wait until she got to the digital piece.
When with drawing children, obviously the height is a good way to show that they're children, but also if you give them like little ears, they also tend to look a little bit more childlike, give them bigger ears. Let's see here. There also would have been more canoes. We only have 2 here. So let's add in some more people coming home. little, there we go.
Emily also did this for the 3rd grade. So the 3rd grade got the comic books, and then she zoomed into the class and showed them how she did the drawing and how she connected to the historical photographs.
Yeah. I also made them a drawing tips worksheet that I will put into the chat, so everybody can use that if you'd like to get a little bit more in depth with how to do some of this drawing.
Or show it to kids to have them do it.
Yeah. Drawings for everybody. Maybe like one more canoe here. Obviously, this would be a little bit neater.
And maybe just one more thing, because we want to leave time for questions.
Ah, yes. Okay. The other thing, let's see here, that I mentioned before was atmospheric perspective and giving things more depth. So you'll have, you'll select the skyline like that. Go around the edges. And then you'll get a gradient here. Amazing. Just that little detail really adds a lot, doesn't it?
Pretty amazing.
There we go. Oops.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there are some edits to make this page more detailed, more accurate. There's obviously always more to learn. But that's a good start to show you how easy it is to make changes once you have the information. So you can start a little basic and then add in what you need to.
I think one of the reasons why it's important to have Emily sort of walk through some of this, especially if you want to do a comic book or work with an artist, is to really be clear with the artist on what their process is. Because as I said before, I wasted a ton of Emily's time when I didn't quite realize when the detail work came in, and I fussed over pencil sketches and a little too much. And I should have waited a little longer. So I would say it's worth talking to the artist and having them walk through all the different stages and being really clear as to when changes should be made and when the most of them are. So
yeah,
it's a little.
But we got our process down for the next one.
Right. So why don't we stop our screen sharing and see what kinds of questions people have.
All right.
We just shared a huge project with you.
Yeah. Kind of blew through it a little quickly, but hopefully you got some good information from that. And even stick figures can be a good comic. So if you have the right information to go with it.
Are there any questions?
Let's see some of these questions. Let me see here, scroll up.
I think everybody's just absorbing it all.
Might CCS be open to setting up liaison between students and local historical societies? Many of us won't have talented artists available locally. Thank you for considering this. Yeah, CCS students are always looking for work, and they are local here in White River Junction. And they have a wide range of different things that they focus on, but there are a lot of people like me there who love history and do history comics about a lot of different topics. And I am sure that CCS would be open to that, and I'd be happy to help make those connections. I am also happy to do more history comics myself. So yeah.
Future projects. Well, we at the Historical Society recently, right at COVID, put together an exhibition on the women's activism. It began with sewing circles in the 19th century, and it went all the way through women making pussy hats and climate change scarves. So it was a lot about how women were voices for change in our community. And we've written a grant to the Vermont Humanities Council to see if we could turn that into a comic book, because that also fits with our curriculum, our local curriculum. So our early schooling comic book is really being geared towards second grade, that looks at schooling as a beginning of examining primary sources and thinking and having some historical thinking skills. The early settlement one is third grade, because the third grade curriculum looks at the history of the town and the Abenaki and this early settlement. And fifth grade does a lot with democracy and town government. And so it seemed like this women's activism one might be an appropriate one to fit with the fifth grade. So that is hopefully in the works. In terms of podcast driving tours, we are doing a feast and farm fundraiser this year. Podcast driving tours now, everybody wants them in our town. Like I get calls all the time now. And so at Christmas, when we couldn't do our normal Christmas pageant, which goes through the community, the Christmas pageant moms asked me to stitch together the narration for that script, which I did for them. And they actually turned that into a video. But our feast and farm tour in June will cover working farms and historic hill farms in the community. And that's the loop I'm working on right now, where people will stop at the working farms and pick up food to make a meal, and then also go to some of the hill farms where they'll be able to get out of the car and actually see historic photos. So this is going to be a fundraiser. So it's not all just free. And I see a hand up. Beth?
I would also like to add real quick to that. For any, so you also asked topics that are more or less suited for comic retelling. Good thing about comics is that they're so versatile. You don't necessarily need a narrative to be able to make a great history comic. I did one that was a spotter's guide for New England gravestone art, and I didn't really get into the story of any of the graves. It's just a comic book that's what the different symbols mean. So there's actually a lot of different ways to apply this. You don't necessarily need a really strong narrative with a lot of research about people and their lives to have a informative history comic, or something cool about different types of architecture. Again, doesn't need a really detailed story. Just a good comic for like driving around town and looking, instead of getting sucked in to trying to build a narrative out of information that you might not actually have access to. So
yeah, we were looking at putting together one that's all about how to identify your barn and date it. Those agricultural buildings are so incredibly vulnerable. And we have so many new people coming to our community that we thought it would be a helpful thing to do. We don't have the funding for that yet, but it's something I think is pretty important to create. So Beth, sorry.
That's great. In the follow-up material, it would be great to have a list of places, Emily, where we can access the material you've already done. So we can print copies, show people, or purchase copies, however it works. So we can work up enthusiasm. But I also have a sort of statewide question on this. When you open up the map function on your smartphone, it will show you, if you're in a city, it will show you where the parking garages are and things like that. I would love to see statewide that when people come into Vermont and turn on their smartphones, historic sites and features pop up all over the map. Can we sort of segue that in with the whole podcast project idea?
Interesting thought.
Yeah. Oh, I have to look into that.
Something for Eileen to take back to Vermont Historical Society and the State Tourism Bureau, perhaps.
I bet there's a way to drop pins on the map for locations, so that we could maybe like somehow set up, like a link that you could click on that would take you to all of these pins. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there are some places that have done sort of apps, which is kind of the way you have to go, unfortunately, because there's different mapping. There's Google Maps and there's Apple Maps, and all those guys have their map stuff. But there are certainly map apps that have been made or could be made and we've talked a little bit about that before. So I think that's one of those percolating projects to sort of keep thinking about. And again, I think I'd love, again, this idea, with Sarah talking about new people to their community, I think is a really wonderful thing, but then also, right, capturing folks who are just passing through and might be interested in learning more. And what I like about this for local societies is you don't have to be open for people to access this information and do the podcast driving tour. And for a lot of local societies, when you're not open 5 to 7 days a week, I think that's a really key part of this.
Yeah, we really haven't been open except by research appointment since March, but we've had more people engaged in our programming and history than in years. And the number of members we now have has exploded from this too. So it's generated new memberships.
The comics are available in our general store. So anybody who's missed them so far, now will see them at checkout and get involved in the history.
Yeah, they're for sale there, and they're on our website as flip books. So you can look at them on our website too. Rachel.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to follow up on what Eileen said in answer to Beth's question and to say hello to everybody. It's wonderful to see you. I met with Laura Treichman, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and Jess Robinson, who Director of Archaeology for the state, last week about a project we've talked about for years now, about mapping our cultural assets in Vermont. And part of our motivation is for disaster preparedness and resilience and awareness of floodplains and good stuff like that, and how those intersect with our cultural heritage here, both built and in terms of the collections that those buildings may hold. But I think there's a way that some of that data, which would be presumably, we're thinking about it as being a layer in the planning atlas available through the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, VCGI. And if you've not checked out that site, I don't really know how to use their maps, but they're amazing looking. And there are there's so much data there, and you can overlay different layers to learn more things. So there's a project in the works, Beth, that might provide some data that is mapped that could then, as others are saying, like Eileen's saying, could be bundled into an app for more of a historical focus or informational focus.
Yes, I think it's true. The care of barns, how to identify barns would be useful statewide. And as I was thinking, I was like, I wonder if Cabot Cheese would pay for something like that. Maybe we'll think about it in that way too. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Well, I'm thinking our cultural assets are part of our brand. And so all of our corporations that connect to the Vermont brand can have a gain from all mapping of cultural and historical assets. So we need to be talking about that on a state level. I don't mean to go sort of neoliberal on it, but all of the companies benefit from how Vermont presents itself. So we should be able to gain funding. We should be able to gain partners in that way.
Yeah. Vermont is full of people who love Vermont and would love to learn more about it.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I don't see any other questions. If anyone wants to engage in this kind of project and has questions, you should feel free to ask. If it's something you want to try embarking on your own, I'd be glad to coach you a little bit. It really actually wasn't, I mean, I'm kind of a techie person, but I really had never used any audio anything before I started this, and I figured it out. And our local cable access TV folks, their mission is to teach community members how to use the equipment and to do this work. And so actually, we'll show you one final thing is to end us all off. I'm gonna share my screen. and show you what CATV did with our podcast. They went on a drive. I'll jump it along.
The enormous trees using the big trunks and limbs for log cabins and outbuildings. They placed the stumps of the trees in rows for the first fencing and then burned the remaining debris. If a good burn resulted.
So you can see they, CATV, which wants to generate more content, took our two of our podcasts. They got into their little convertible car and scooted all over town, and it's actually really fun to watch because they sped it up, and so he's like zooming through all of the roads on the town, and people from out of town who had moved away absolutely loved seeing that. But that, you know, you can reach out to your local cable access, and they might be willing to put together a podcast for you. It's also something that I know that teachers are dying to do, and I've received a few requests from teachers to put together a teacher workshop on this, which I think I may try to do this summer. I may work with a teacher in Chester to create one with kids so that I can sort of get more kid tips. But there are other ways to go about doing this, and there are people, I think, in the communities or in your county who might be really interested in doing it with you.
It has been very, very fun collaborating with my hometown to delve into our history, and I'm sure there's people all over that feel similarly who would also like to work on something like this. So, a lot of resources everywhere you look.
All right, well, I don't have anything else to add unless anyone else does, but I want to just say thanks for joining us today, and do be in touch if you have other specific questions or you'd like some help.
And head to the Norwich Historical Society website to read the comics in full in the flip books.
Yeah, and there was a request to make sure to have your contact information. So you guys can put it in the chat here if you want, but we'll also be following up to everybody that registered with a link to the recording and slides and such afterwards as well. So we'll hope to get everybody in touch with each other that either wants to get a little bit more details or a little bit of follow-up help, or to work with Emily, which sounds absolutely fantastic. So I think my one final question, I know, Sarah, obviously this kind of happened with the pandemic, but what do you think, maybe non-pandemic, a time frame for sort of making this project, you know, completing a driving tour and a podcast comic book would take?
You know, it kind of depends, I think, on it. You know, Emily and I created the early settlement one pretty quickly, and then the Mills and Rivers took forever. And I kind of held her up a little bit. It was a more challenging one, but you know, the podcast, we're working on one right now, and I have a volunteer working on the script. And I, you know, if you work with your local cable access, you know, it's a day of recording and a day of editing and a day of sort of getting it online. So a lot more of the work is in the figuring out part of what your tour is going to be and what your script's going to be. Those pieces take a little bit longer in some ways than the tech pieces, which can flow together fairly quickly or smoothly. You know, especially if you have, there may even be someone in your community who knows how to do it. It's amazingly, you know, my kids can do it, so.
Kids can do it. Yeah.
Yes, they can do it. They can. There are probably high school kids in your town who could do it. So, you know, your job is to figure out the route and making sure there's good parking and that privacy is being considered, and you have a good story to tell that's inclusive and contextual and not solely genealogical. Something that will really capture the interests of your community. That to me, you know, when I look at walking tours, we have some walking tours on our website that are really like basically the deed history of the house that no one really wants to go on now. And the ones that are about social justice or about you know, women or other kinds of stories are just so much more engaging.
Last chance, I think, before we go.
All right.
Questions? All right, awesome. All right, well, I will say thank you very much to Sarah and Emily for sharing their process and their information. And again, I look forward to seeing what else Norwich is doing, and then maybe what else you all do with some of this information and some really great projects. Thanks.